Hello everyone. So this is part two of the chapter demand and supply. In the first part, we discussed about the demand curve. In this part, we are going to discuss about the supply curve. And in part three, we will discuss about the equilibrium analysis, but that's for later on. So the supply curve. First, we are going to discuss the definition, which is right here. The definition of supply curve. That is the first part of the lecture. In the second part, we are going to see the graph. In the third part, we are going to see, in the third point, we are going to see the difference between change in quantity supplied versus change in supply. That's the third part. Fourth, we are going to discuss the market supply curve. And five, we are going to see the determinants of supply curve. So these are the 5 points we will discuss in this lecture. But first, we are going to see the definition of the supply curve. Supply curve in economics is the graphic representation of the relationship between product price and quantity of product that a seller is willing and able to supply. So this is the first part of the supply curve's definition. It simply means that the supply curve is a graphic representation which shows the relationship between the price of a product and its quantity sold at different price levels. And the second part of the definition means that the product price is measured on the vertical axis or the y-axis of the graph, and the quantity of product supplied on the horizontal axis or the x-axis. So it simply means that on y-axis we have price level, on x-axis we have quantity. So supply curve is simply a relationship, graphical representation of the price and quantity supplied of a product. We will discuss it in much more detail in the next slide. So now we will see the supply curve in the form of a graph. So here, just ignore this part for now. Concentrate on the left side, on this side. On the y-axis, we have prices: $0.5, $1, $2, $5, and $3. And on the x-axis, we have quantity of ice cream cones sold. So we are continuing with the previous example of ice creams that we used for demand curve. So here on the x-axis we have quantity, on the y-axis price of ice cream. So at the price 0.5 we see a spot, which simply means that at 0.5 price the supplier will not supply the ice cream. So this is an individual supplier we are talking about right now in this example. So individual supplier, one supplier. So for that one supplier at price 0.5, he will not sell any ice creams. At price 1, the point that we get is here. So at price 1, the quantity that the seller is willing and able to sell is 1. At price 1.5, the point is the quantity sold is 2. At price 2, the willingness is 3. At 2.5 it's 4, and at 3 the willingness to sell ice cream is 5. So when we join all of these points, we get the supply curve. So this is a supply curve. So from this you can easily now let's look at this part. It says that it is a graphic representation of the relationship between product price and quantity of product that a seller is willing and able to sell. So as you can see on the supply curve, on the x-axis we have the quantity, on the y-axis we have the price of ice cream. So if at the price 0.5, like here, the quantity that individual seller is willing to sell is 0, and as the price level increases, his willingness will obviously increase. So assume you are the ice cream seller, and if you get 0.5 price, then you will not sell ice cream because it's not profitable. At 1, you will increase the supply to a quantity 1. And as the price will keep on increasing, it will be more profitable for the supplier to sell more ice creams. So he will keep on increasing the supply. So product price is measured on the vertical axis of the graph, as you can see on the vertical axis right here, and quantity of product supplied on the horizontal axis, which is simply here. So this is a supply curve. It simply shows the relationship between price and quantity. At different price level, how much quantity of a product that a seller is willing to supply. Let's move on to the law of supply. The law of supply simply states that there is a direct or positive relationship between price and quantity supplied. So I'm going to move backward to the previous slide. As you can see, the slope is going upward. So this positive slope simply means that there is a positive relationship between x-axis and y-axis. So whenever the curve or the slope goes upward from left to right, it means that there is a positive relationship or positive slope. So this simply supply curve simply is stating that the law of supply, which means that there is a direct or positive relationship between price and quantity supplied. The higher the price, the higher the quantity supplied. So there is a positive relationship, positive slope, or you can say upward slope. That is what the law of supply tells us. Alright, so now we are going to talk about change in quantity supplied versus change in supply. The way we talked about this in demand curve was also similar. Change in quantity demanded versus change in demand. When we were talking about change in quantity demanded, we were only one variable, that is price, was changing. But when we talked about change in demand, there used to be a shift in the demand curve. It is a very similar concept which you will be studying right here, right now. Alright, so quantity supplied is the amount of a good that sellers are willing and able to sell at different price levels. So when we talk about quantity supplied, change in quantity supplied, this is what we are talking about. So when there is a rise in the price of ice cream cones, it results in a movement along the supply curve. So when the price increases from $1 to $3, the movement along the supply curve is from point A to point C. See? So when the price level increases from 1 to 3, that is the price is on the y-axis, and the variable that is changing is, you can see that variable on the graph, that is price, right? Whenever you can see the variable on the graph and that point is changing, that variable is changing, and at that point we are talking about change in quantity supplied. So when we talk about other variables that we are going to talk about later on, like the other determinants which are not present on the graph, then we are talking about change in supply. But here we are talking about change in quantity supplied. Whenever there is a rise in the price level of the product, that is an important thing to remember, a rise in the price. So this is a change in quantity supplied. Now we are going to talk about change in supply. So when there is a change in supply, we are talking about shifts in the supply curve. So either there is a rightward shift, which means increase in supply, or there is a leftward shift, which is a decrease in supply. So the difference is simple. So when we are talking about change in quantity supplied, like we talked about here, change in quantity supplied, there is a movement along the supply curve right here. A movement along the supply curve. But when we are talking about change in supply, we are talking about shifts in the supply curve. Alright, so This is the summary of change in quantity supplied versus change in supply. The first variable here, we have the price level variable that affect quantity supplied. These are the variables that affect the quantity supplied by a supplier. These are also called the determinants of a supply curve, which we will go into much more detail in the next slide. But here we are just going to see the differences in change in quantity supplied versus change in supply. So this is present on the graph, the price level. And whenever the variable is present on the graph, it represents a movement along the supply curve. So we are talking about change in quantity supplied in this case. But in the case of these variables, in the case of these factors or determinants, that is input prices, technology, expectations, and number of sellers, this will cause a shift in the supply curve. Not a movement along the supply curve, but a shift in the supply curve. Alright, so let's talk about market supply. Market supply refers to the sum of all individual supplies for all sellers of a particular good or service. So the graph that we saw previously of the supply curve, that was the supply curve graph of an individual supplier. So assume there are 5 different sellers: A, B, C, D, E. And we are going to make graphs of each of them: B, C, D, E. Alright, and then we will make a market supply curve. So first, this is the supply curve of each person. This is just hypothetical supply curves. Here we have price level, here we have quantity, price level, quantity, Q, P, Q, P, Q. So at price level 2, we are going to see the supply for each supplier. So at price 2, the supplier A is willing to sell how many ice creams? Let's assume it's 2. For B, he is willing to sell 1 ice cream. For C, he or she is willing to sell 5 ice creams. Another supplier is willing to sell 3 ice creams. Another supplier, it's at the price of 2, is willing to sell 4 ice creams. These are all hypothetical numbers: 2, 1, 5, 2, 1, 5, 3, 4. So these are individual supply curves. To get the market supply curve, which is here at price level 2, we will just add 2 plus 1 is 3 plus 5 is 8 plus 3 is 11 plus 4 is 15. So at price 2, the market supply curve will be 15. And similarly, we will see how much at price 1 each supplier is willing to supply. At price 3, how much each supplier is willing to supply. And then when we will get the quantity at each price level at 1 and 3, we can join the points and we will get a supply curve, a market supply curve. That's how a market supply curve is made. So this simply means that a market supply curve is graphically individual supply curves are summed horizontally to obtain the market supply curve. I've written above this statement, but I hope you can see it. So this is what we have done. We have added individual supply curves horizontally to get the market supply curve. Now we are going to talk about the determinants of supply curve. So the first determinant is the market price. The second one is input prices, technology, expectations, number of producers, and some other. So here we are going to talk about ice creams. So the first one, the market price. What will it do to the supply curve? Will it shift the supply curve, or will it lead to a movement along the supply curve? That's a question. So I hope you guys know the answer. It's the movement along the supply curve. It will not lead to a shift in the supply curve, but a movement along the supply curve. And the other ones, these will lead to a shift in the supply curve. So determinants of supply curve. What are the determinants of supply curve anyway? So the determinants of supply curve or determinants of supply simply are those factors which lead to a change in quantity supplied or a change in supply. So for example, the first one, market price. If the price of ice cream increases, the profit of suppliers will increase. So they will be willing to supply more ice creams. But if the price of ice creams decrease, then the profit of suppliers of ice creams will decrease. So they will supply less ice creams. So that's the first point. The second one, that's another determinant of supply, which will lead to a shift in the supply curve. So the input prices. Ice cream manufacturers use several inputs like labor, and sweeteners, sugar, and building where they make ice cream, and a lot of different inputs. So if the price of these inputs increase, then the profits of suppliers will decrease, right? So whenever the price of inputs increase, then the suppliers will supply less ice cream, and there will be a shift of the supply curve to the left side. And whenever the input prices decrease, the profits of suppliers will increase and they will supply more ice cream, and it will lead to a shift towards the right side of the supply curve, of the ice cream supply curve. And the third one, now we are going to talk about technology. So ice cream was produced manually before in the past. So there used to be a lot of laborers who used to produce ice cream, but now there are ice cream making machines. So after the introduction of these machines, the production of ice cream increased dramatically. So before, if someone needed 100 laborers to produce ice cream, now they just need 5 laborers and a lot of ice cream making machines. So whenever the technology improves, the production also increases. So whenever technology improves or increases, it leads to an increase in the supply. So what will it do? So this is a supply curve. It will lead to a shift towards the right of the supply curve. This is S1, this is S2. So whenever technology improves, the supply curve shifts towards the right. The fourth point is expectations. As we discussed in the demand curve, expectations, suppliers also have expectations. So if the suppliers expect the price level of ice creams to increase in the future, so they will stockpile the ice creams that they produce now, so they can supply the ice cream later on when the prices are higher. So if they expect the prices of ice cream in future to be lower, then they will supply more ice cream today and less in the future. So the expectations also mean that if the expectations are good, then they will supply less today and more in the future. But if their expectations of price level are low in the future, they will supply more today and less tomorrow. And finally, we have the number of producers. The more number of producers you have of ice creams, the more supply there will be in the market. So if there are just 2 suppliers in the market of ice creams, then there will not be a lot of supply of ice cream. But if there are, for example, 20, then there are more producers, so they can supply more ice cream. And if there are 200 suppliers, that means that the quantity of ice cream produced will be much higher than in the case of then when you compare it with the number of suppliers when there are only 2. And when the number of suppliers increase to 2000, that means that the supply of ice cream in the market will increase much more and much more dramatically. So the more number of suppliers there are of a certain good, the higher supply there is of that good, and that will lead to a rightward shift in the supply curve. Alright, so there might be other determinants as well, but these are the determinants that we are going to discuss in this lecture. So other determinants, if you can think of those determinants, those might be perfectly right. Some books have, some other books of microeconomics might have those determinants written as well. So with this, we finish our part two of the lecture of demand and supply. In this lecture, we discussed the supply curve, what is a supply curve, how it is made, what is the market supply, what is the difference between change in quantity supplied and change in supply, and finally we studied the determinants of supply curve. So we have finished the demand curve, and now we have finished the supply curve in part two. In part three, we are going to discuss the equilibrium analysis. That is when demand and supply meet. Those are called the equilibrium analysis. But that's for the next lecture. I hope you understood perfectly what a supply curve is. So I will see you guys in the next lecture then.